Hello, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video form of a blog post which did all the way back on the 17th of June 2013, so almost 10 years ago, and it's called Why I Prefer Third Person. This is for both books and my own personal writing, and obviously this is no means intended as a bash against those of you guys who might prefer or like first person books, like either for writing or reading. It's just, my own personal preferences, and hopefully you'll understand my reasoning as I go along. So anyway, in spite of my current overall weariness with the first-person trend, which I still stand by that sentiment, I really don't dislike it at all. I've read quite a few books that were absolutely perfect and natural with first person, and can't imagine how they would have been in third person. These include Jerzy Kosinski's The Painted Bird, one of the most haunting, unforgettable books I've ever read. That final line is just wow, just hits me, all the right places. Several of Hermann Hesse's novels, he was an absolute master at writing in first person, just, worked so well with both his, writing style and the kind of books he was writing. Anything by Mark Twain, one of my absolute favorite writers. Sholem Aleichem's Tevye the Dairyman, which is actually not a novel, it's just a collection of short stories, which most people are familiar with. It was later turned into the film and play Fiddler on the Roof, and actually I recently saw a Yiddish language film from sometime in the 30s, I believe it was 38, 39, called Tevye, and it focused on the story of his daughter Hava, who intermarries, and I was really pleasantly surprised because it's like a Yiddish language film and not a big Hollywood glossy production. It actually is true to the book what happens at the end when Hava actually regrets her decision and divorces her Gentile husband and comes back to her family. So I knew that was just a really interesting thing. I loved how they diverted from the Hollywood interpretation and Adventures of Motel the Cantor's Son, which was also a wonderful book written by Sholem Aleichem. I highly recommend him if you guys are interested in Yiddish literature. And of course the classic Catcher in the Rye. And I've never understood this trend lately for people to bash it, oh, I'm so cool, I'm bashing Holden and Catcher in the Rye, oh, look how hip I am, I don't like a kid who's meant to be, kind of an unlikable narrator, and he's this way because he's going through a lot of traumatic events in his life, but oh, I'm so cool because I'm just bashing Catcher in the Rye. Seriously, try to understand the story in the historical context it came out in, and Holden himself as a character. It's just these people are just trying to be, oh, I'm too hip and pretentious, I'm just going to bash Catcher in the Rye. I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record. But since first person has become so common in the last 5 to 10 years, and actually since this was written 10 years ago, it's more 15, 20 years, it really seems to have lost a lot of the zing it used to have. When every other book feels like it's first person these days, it makes it harder for a distinctive first person narrator to stand out. It's really hard to capture that point of view well, and there needs to be a compelling reason why this person is telling the story in the first place. Some of my reasons for preferring to read and write to first person. Number one, it obviously differs by genre, but in the genres I most prefer to read, there are many characters and storylines. You can't cover all that ground when the story is being filtered through only one person's point of view. Breaking a complex story up into alternating narrators just feels disjointed to me, like watering the story down. In the genre I write, if you guys don't know already, in which I most prefer to read, is historical fiction, and traditionally the classic form is set over many years, and it has a large ensemble cast. So when you have sometimes 15, 20 characters or more, and not necessarily all main, but many important secondary characters in there, you can't just focus on one person. That's just totally weird and disjointed. And I should do a future video on this based on a blog post which I wrote. Julie Orangers. Hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. It might be Oringer, but I just don't know. Sorry. But anyway, her book The Invisible Bridge, it was written in third person limited, but that really didn't work. Well, the book itself didn't work at all at any single level for me. But one of the reasons it didn't work was because it was third person limited when it's just such a large ensemble cast. I didn't want to be stuck in this annoying dude's head for the entire book without looking into anyone else in the book. So anyway, number two, it feels easier to create a distinctive voice and personality for each character, even minor ones. You're not limited to deep character development for only one person. It's just it's so limiting for me. I don't understand why so many of these young whippersnappers these days feels oh, it's not personal enough if it's third person and we're looking at all these different people instead of sticking to one person. Yeah, don't you can't you understand stories that have multiple important characters in it? Can you only read and and appreciate in such a book that has just one single main character? I just cannot relate to that at all. So anyway, number three, there needs to be some important reason why a story can only be told by a first person narrator. When in doubt, use third person. To me, it's not about needing to feel super duper close to a narrator and write in his or her head. It's about the overall feel of the story. A more personal story like Damien by Hermann Hesse, or the above mentioned The Painted Bird, works in first person because it's so focused on the journey of just one person, and it wouldn't feel right at all if it were in third person. In that case, it would, like just feel like inappropriately distant and just like not what this story needed and what works for it. Number 4, there are some situations I would hope that everyone, or at least in the 21st century, would find morally repugnant, like a 13-year-old having a sexual relationship with a guy in his 20s, a 15-year-old dating a 30-year-old, or incest. But sometimes these situations arise out of very complex circumstances, and obviously that is in no way means like me trying to justify or excuse it. That's just basically putting it in context. Like, for example, like teenage siblings who are close in age and they've been like parentified from a young age. Their parents are basically emotionally distant or abandon them. So basically from a young age, they've been like basically like doing all these adult responsibilities, taking care of the house and raising younger siblings. And so gradually over time, they might start to feel like they're the true parents of those children, and they start like without like doing it on purpose, God forbid, like relating to one another as like, husband and wife, because that's basically the role they've been filling all these years. And sometimes, that just culminates in incest. I know there was a book about this a while ago with a situation like that. And obviously, I'm not saying that's morally right at all, but just like, for example, like that might like kind of make sense, like intellectually anyway, like, and kind of like understand why it happened, even if you think that's like gross. But like and obviously like for a lot of these like, creepy age gap relationships with minors, like obviously not excusing the dude for grooming the underage girl at all, but like, for example, if she comes from a broken home, a lot of trauma and such like that, like some guy will like take advantage of her and groom her and such like that, and she'll feel like, oh, I'm more mature than a 15-year-old. I'm not really 15, I'm more like 30, and that's totally makes sense for me to like date much older dudes and things like that. And so basically I'm getting back to the topic. It's harder to because these situations arise out of very complex circumstances. It's harder to convey that this kind of relationship is wrong and can't end well if it's in first person. Third person also gives us more backstory into it than squee. I must be so mature if a college guy wants to sleep with me. We're soulmates after only 2 dates. Like, seriously, that, like, first person and third person, it makes all the difference in the world in handling that kind of, like a complex situation. Number 5, the misuse of first person leads to the unreliable narrator, someone who might be lying about everything, someone without enough maturity or distance yet to put any kind of self-reflection on things. Number 6, if I hate the character or find him or her boring, I don't want to spend 300 plus pages in his or her head. It's easier to take a flawed character if there's that distance of third person. We have a better sense of their motivations and backstory and don't just have to take their word for everything. Number 7, if the stakes are high, I basically know a first person narrator will survive. In third person, the suspense is there all the time. Will a soldier survive the war? Will his family escape Vietnam? How many of these characters are going to survive the Shoah? Number 8, I like to see things beyond just one person. We're stuck with one person's experiences and voice for a whole book in first person. That also it extends as well to third person limited. Like, even if it is like focused on just one particular character, we still like, it's important to build like a fully realized story if we like get little peeks into other important characters. And that's also why I really don't do third person limited, even when like the rare few times I do a book that's like basically like all on like just one character, or maybe like 2 at most. It's still like, technically for all intents and purposes third person omniscient, because we're like looking at things beyond just like deep in this like particular character or 2 characters points of view. And so anyway, number 9, third person feels more like reading a story about someone instead of someone telling me a story. Number 10, there's a strong tendency for less experienced writers to put too much of themselves into a first person voice. Sometimes it feels more like the writer's voice and opinions, not those of a fictional character. And I do realize this is like kind of inevitable. Sometimes we will like subconsciously maybe just put our own like spin on things, like our own beliefs come through. Like, for example, I'm like very, very like far to the left politically. I'm an old school socialist, and that's, not something I'll ever apologize for. And so basically, like, as a result, many of my own characters are like, old school, like left-wing Democrats, like socialists, even communists. But that's like, I'm not trying to like push my own views. It's just like those are who these characters naturally are, and just because it's the way I am too. And so basically, like, when you're like inexperienced, you'll basically just like pushing like, this is my own view, and not just, this is how it manifests in this particular character. And like other characters who have the similar political views, they don't like express it in all the same way, or they're not constantly talking about it. But when you're like less experienced and younger and such, you might like put a whole different spin, not be able to separate like how your characters do something from the way you personally believe, even if it does like come from you and is inspired you. Obviously, that's like kind of a complicated thing for a whole other subject. And so, anyway, number 11. If a book is set over a long period of time, it's easier to change someone's voice in third person. I don't want to read essentially the same voice from the 12-year-old in the beginning, the 16-year-old in the middle, and the 25-year-old at the end. A first-person voice needs to mature along with the character, and this was one of the few complaints I had about Anne C. Verhoeven's, hopefully I'm pronouncing her name correctly, on My Family for the War, which was originally published in German as Liverpool Street. This is one of the like finest modern YA books I've read. I don't know when it was published. It must have been maybe like close to 20 years, but anyway, like the narrator Ziska, who becomes Frances after she goes to England with the kinder transport. She's like, I think like 10 or 11 when the book starts, and she's like 17 when the main meat of the story ends. And then there's like a short epilogue when she's like in her early 20s, somewhere in her 20s. I'm sorry, I forget the exact age. And basically, like her voice sounds like pretty much like the same throughout the entire book. So like, there's not really that much difference between like the little girl like living in Germany and like not really understanding what's going on around her, these like intense world events, and like coming to England and starting to like get used to British society, versus like the more mature 17-year-old who's starting a romance with 21-year-old Walter, who also came on the kinder transport with her. And luckily Walter was like blessed enough to bring his father with him. So that was just like one of the complaints I had about it. And when you do it in like third person, like it's easier to like, for example, the vocabulary starts becoming like more like mature and complex and such, and just the character, the way they express themselves. And like, I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record. This is what happens when I like, totally go off my talking points. But anyway, it's just like harder to convey that in like in first person versus third person, because like a first person voice, like it needs to mature along with the character, and if you can't do that, just do third person. So number 12, you can use more mature language and thoughts in third person. Yeah, getting back to what I was just talking about. Just because a typical 13-year-old might not know a word like gregarious, xenophilic, or pilfer doesn't mean the narrator can't use it when describing his or her thoughts or backstory. And if I have to see one more young narrator reflecting with the maturity way beyond his or her years, it's like, and seriously, like, and anyway, getting back to that point, I've seen many people, like, they're trying to be helpful, critiquing works like, oh, would an 8-year-old really know or use a word like stroll or something? And I think there's, like, just not, like, super duper, like, $1,000,000 thesaurus words, and they're just, like, basic vocabulary words, like, pretty much, like, most kids would have known and used, like, like, 50 years ago or so. And again, if it's, I realize, like, first person, yeah, maybe you can, like, object to, like, a word like manifest being used by, like, a 12-year-old or something, or, like, paradigm or dichotomy. But when it's the third person narrator using the voice, it's not the like character, him or herself, using that word. It's the narrator using the omniscient, or the like the third person narrator using that word like to describe something in the story or on the younger character's behalf. It's just like seriously, do these people have no experience or familiarity with like third person omniscient anymore? I'm sorry if I'm getting off topic. I'm just like so passionate about this subject and just feel so strongly that third person is like superior in so many instances. And number 13, I just like the objective distance that comes with third person and the ability to follow multiple characters and storylines. And I know this might sound kind of critical and such, and I should do a future video on this if I haven't already. One of my current works in progress, my alternative history about Dante and Beatrice, is in first person from Dante's perspective. And that kind of like, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I first came up with the idea back in 2004 in the spring of writing this story, that it would be in first person. That would feel like the most natural and only perfect point of view. But again, that was because like I have so much familiarity with all these things, and it just felt like it would have been completely wrong to be in the third person. I did have my own moment of doubt, like I am not Aeneas, I am not Paul, neither I nor anyone would deem me worthy. And so if I start on this journey, I fear it would be an act of folly, and I would like abandon it before it gets too far. You are wise, you understand more than your words. Like, so basically, like, I had to go through that moment of doubt with myself and wondering if this was really the right decision. It was like, oh, it has to be first person, I'm just going to blaze ahead with it, like no matter what. This couldn't be like wrong at all. So it also helps with like first person when you actually think, should this be in first person or should it be in like third person, like making that decision instead of just, oh, it's the first person as a default because I don't know how to write anything else, or that's basically all I've seen. So thank you guys again very much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing and hitting the notifications bell. I particularly love seeing comments from you guys, and I really hope I can build my channel over this year and have a more active community of subscribers and viewers and engaging with me. Like seeing like comments and support from you guys really means a lot to me, particularly because I have such a tiny channel. And thank you guys again very much for watching. I will see you soon. Thanks. Bye.